times, Judge.
All right. Okay, thank you. Please be seated. The court will call the matter of State of Wisconsin versus Morgan E. Geyser, case number 14 CF 596. Appearances.
State by Ted Sapakowitz and Kevin Osborne.
Thank you and good morning.
Morning, Your Honor. Attorneys Anthony Cotton and Donna Kukler with our consultant Rob Rosenberg and Morgan Geyser here in person.
All right, thank you and good morning. The case is here this morning for sentencing and disposition on the proceedings. Is the state prepared to proceed?
Yes.
And is the defense prepared to proceed?
Yes, just one housekeeping matter before we begin.
Yes.
Ask that Ms. Geyser not be shackled for the hearing, Your Honor, or that her hand shackles be removed.
Well, in the past, we've left it up to the sheriff. If the sheriff believes it's appropriate, they can remove the cuffs from her hands in case she wants to take notes.
They've indicated no, so her feet are shackled too.
Well, I think that's appropriate security.
Okay.
Security is the responsibility of the sheriff's department. I give them the ability to make decisions within reasonable bounds.
Very good.
All right, thank you. I just need to make a couple adjustments. All right, very good. I have the computers set up so I can function from that standpoint. What I wanted to do is just make a brief statement about the case, putting the case in the context for our proceedings this morning. The matter involving Morgan Geyser is before the court this morning based upon a two-phase proceeding. An initial plea of not guilty was entered to the charge of the information, which is one of attempted first-degree intentional homicide, party to a crime with a dangerous weapon. And then a second plea was entered of not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect. The matters were set for a jury trial on both the criminal charge and on the NGI plea. On October 5, 2017, Ms. Geyser entered a plea of guilty to the amended information of attempted first-degree intentional homicide, party to the crime. The enhancer with a dangerous weapon was struck. She was found guilty of that offense based upon the plea. Further, the state and Ms. Geyser agreed that the court could use the reports that had been submitted with regard to the not guilty by reason of mental disease and defect plea as a basis to proceed. Based upon those reports, I found the reports sufficient and then found Ms. Geyser not guilty of the offense by reason of mental disease or defect, and I made that finding by clear and convincing evidence. The jury trial was removed from the court calendar on both issues. The court then ordered the department to submit a predispositional report and further ordered that Drs. Lundbohm and Burney prepare supplemental reports. They had prepared reports previously with regard to the issues. These reports have been received. The matter was then set for a dispositional sentencing hearing to today's date, and we're here for that process. The maximum sentence on the criminal charge is 60 years imprisonment, which breaks down to 40 years of initial confinement, 20 years of extended supervision. The case proceeds on the commitment basis, with the maximum commitment being 40 years. Previously, the state had recommended that they would pursue a maximum commitment of 40 years and institutional placement. Ms. Geyser is free to argue for conditional release and other dispositions. Under the Wisconsin statute 971.17 sub 1 sub b states that upon an NGI finding, the court shall commit the person to the Department of Health Services for a period not exceeding the maximum period of confinement, which in this case would be 40 years. The court entered that initial commitment. Ms. Geyser is also civilly committed based upon other proceedings that have taken place, and based upon that commitment and orders of the court, she resides at the Winnebago Mental Health Institute. The court has read the reports of Drs. Lundbohm and Burney. I read the predispositional report. I have a report from Dr. Robbins, and I have the victim impact statement submitted by Ms. Lautner. With that, then, the court is prepared to proceed. How does the state wish to proceed?
Judge, first, you should also have a victim impact statement from Joseph Lautner, the father.
Let me...
Filed by our office, I believe somewhere around January 19th.
Yeah, I have a victim impact statement filed by Stacy Lautner that was filed on January 19. I have another victim impact statement filed on December 21st. It was signed by Stacy Lautner as well. So is there another document out there I should see?
It's possible, Judge, that the one from the January 19th date was perhaps mislabeled, but it is signed by Mr. Lautner. I can certainly e-file that again.
Well, the one I have filed on the 19th is signed by Stacy Lautner. And it appears to be an exact copy of what was filed in December. So perhaps there was inadvertent misfiling.
That's certainly possible, Judge. We will...
If you want to do it, file it now. I'll read it.
We'll do that as we go along, Judge, so it's available to the court at some point today. We certainly want you to be able to read that and consider it.
All right, very good. That's fine. I'll certainly do that. Does Ms. Geyser's attorneys have a copy of the Joseph Lautner document?
We do not.
All right, so then, well, when it's e-filed, it should go to all attorneys.
Right.
So when it's e-filed, then Mr. Compton and Ms. Kugler should have it as well.
I'm logged in electronically and just looking. I don't see it in the system.
All right. Well, we'll proceed on that basis then. The state will file it, and I'll read it before I reach any final conclusions in the case. And I want then Mr. Compton to have it as well, so he, during his presentation, can be in a position to appropriately respond. With that being said, then, is the state prepared to proceed at this point?
I am, Judge. I'm prepared to call Dr. Brooke Lundbohm.
All right, Dr. Lundbohm, are you here?
Yeah.
Yeah, all right, if you'd come forward.
You swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
And then if you'd be seated and state your full name and spell your last name.
My name is Dr. Brooke Lundbohm. My last name is spelled Lundbohm.
All right, thank you. Just before we begin, I just want to make a couple other adjustments. Yes. All right, I'm prepared. Very good. Thank you.
Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
How are you employed?
I'm currently employed as a licensed psychologist. I am licensed through the state of Wisconsin, and I have a private practice through Behavioral Consultants Incorporated. I also am the clinical director for a Department of Human Services program called the Outpatient Competency Restoration Program, or OCRP.
Is that the competency restoration program? Do you do that only within Milwaukee County, or?
That's statewide
Okay,
for adult offenders.
okay. How long have you been employed in that capacity?
I'm not sure. I've been there a couple years now, so probably about 2, maybe a little bit longer than that.
With the competency restoration?
Right. I was
Okay.
previously employed with Wisconsin Forensic Unit doing competency evaluations prior to taking on that role.
There's a difference between the Wisconsin Forensics Unit and behavioral consultants?
The Wisconsin Forensic Unit is a subset of behavioral consultants. It's a wing, if you will.
Okay. How long have you been with behavioral consultants?
I started with them in 2008 as a postdoctoral forensic psychology fellow. When I was licensed in 2009, I began my employment with them. I've been with them since.
And can you very briefly just outline for us your educational background?
Sure. I have my doctorate degree from the Minnesota School of Professional Psychology, received that degree in 2008. While en route to finishing that, I have my master's degree from that same school, finishing that in 2006. My bachelor degree came from a school called Hamilton College in 2002. I completed a one-year pre-doctoral internship at the Mendota Mental Health Institute. That was my final year of school. And then, as mentioned, completed a one-year postdoctoral forensic psychology fellowship through the Behavioral Consultants and Wisconsin Forensic Unit. That was 2008 to 2009.
And through your employment with behavioral consultants, what percentage of what you do is court-appointed evaluations?
Almost all.
Okay. And it's been that way since 2009?
Right.
And you've obviously been appointed in this case going way back to 2014, is that right?
Right.
And what did you do in this case in 2014?
I was initially assigned through my employment with the Wisconsin Forensic Unit to do a competency examination of Morgan.
And initially, when you did that examination, you found her to not be competent, is that right?
Correct.
You weren't involved in administering any restoration to competency with Morgan, were you?
Correct. I was not involved.
Okay. Were you called upon to do a later evaluation as to whether or not she had become competent?
I was not.
Okay. So your next involvement in this case was a request by the court to do an evaluation as to whether or not she met the standards for being found not guilty by reason of mental disease?
Correct.
And what were your findings in that regard?
I was in support of her special plea.
Can you, I know that's not the issue for today, but briefly tell us why you came to that conclusion?
Well, in review of the totality of evidence, which include conversation, a clinical interview with Morgan, as well as review of a variety of records related to that particular time frame, including discovery materials, medical records following the actual offense, it was my opinion that she was suffering under the effects of a psychotic spectrum disorder at the time that the offense occurred.
And you had authored a report to that effect. Well, actually, you did an evaluation of Morgan on November 7th of 2016, is that right?
I believe the report was submitted to the court on November 7th, 2016.
And you were also then asked by the court to now come forth with an opinion as to whether or not conditional release would be appropriate?
Correct.
And you did author a report in that regard, right?
Correct.
And that's dated November 20th of 2017?
That's correct.
You have that in front of you today?
I do.
Okay. So you had met with Morgan last sometime perhaps in November of 2016, is that right?
With respect
Right.
to this current evaluation?
No, with respect to the NGI evaluation.
If I could just look, I can tell you exact dates.
Okay.
With respect to the mental responsibility evaluation, I met with Morgan at the Winnebago Mental Health Institute on September 9th, 2016, and September 13th, 2016.
And then now, after having been called upon to do an evaluation as to conditional release, you met with her on October 26th, 2017, is that right?
Correct.
So roughly a year and a month had gone by between times you had seen Morgan, is that right?
Correct.
And for purposes of this evaluation regarding conditional release, you reviewed all of the records that were maintained at Winnebago, is that right?
Correct.
As well as all the records you had previously looked at for your other evaluations. Is that true?
Correct.
In the report you just authored regarding conditional release, you found that Morgan has made some progress. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Can you describe what you've noticed as far as progress she's made?
Well, since the various evaluations that I've done, Morgan has noticeably displayed greater psychiatric stability, especially within the context of my very first contact with her in the wake of the actual offense. That being said, while she's definitely benefited from the use of psychotropic medications, she continues to demonstrate symptoms of both a psychosis, but also of what appears to be a post-traumatic stress syndrome that includes depression and anxiety.
And what do you rely upon to say that she continues to show some symptoms?
That's based upon her self-report during our clinical interview, as well as my observations during our clinical interview, but also by review of a variety of documents related to her institutional care, her treatment happening at Winnebago.
In terms of her self-report, when did she indicate to you, when you interviewed her on October 26th, was the last time she had had some, I guess I'll call it hallucination, but if you can put it however you would phrase it?
She had reported that she had last heard an auditory hallucination of a voice that she calls Maggie just a few weeks before our contact.
A few weeks prior to October 26th.
Correct.
And in your review of the notes from her care at Winnebago, did you find anything in there that indicated that she still showed symptoms?
Her records are quite interesting, actually, when it comes to the specific symptoms related to psychosis. When looking at her records, particularly over that year and 1 month time frame since when I last have seen her, the first several months describe her as consistently complaining of auditory hallucinations, especially related to this voice that she names Maggie. It was in about, I believe, March of 2017. And I can just look here to make sure. In about March of 2017, her treating psychiatrist made some changes to her medication regimen such that she's now prescribed Haldol, which is an antipsychotic medication. And with the use of that agent, her description of hearing that voice has reduced. She's saying that she still hears that voice periodically. It's less intense, less frequent, and that's the same report that she provided to me in October while we were meeting for this evaluation, and as mentioned, said that she last heard that voice of Maggie just a few weeks prior to when we were meeting.
And you mentioned that after the medication change to the Haldol, that Maggie at least became less intense?
Correct.
Meaning what?
The way that she describes it, that voice became less menacing, less mean, less frequent. She had previously been reporting hearing this particular voice up to several times a day. It was relatively frequent, causing her quite a bit of distress. Once Haldol was added to the medication regimen, they made some changes to those actual prescribed psychotropic medications for... Sure, they had made some changes to the psychotropic medications specific to psychosis, and with Haldol, her report of that voice has greatly diminished, although still present.
In looking at the records, you were able to determine that medication changes have occurred regularly? Would that be fair to
Yes.
say? In fact, when was the last medication change that you were aware of?
It appeared that there were changes happening even within the weeks prior to my contact. I'm just looking at my report here. In June of 2017, her psychiatrist added Topamax to her medication regimen. Shortly after that, a few weeks later, added Klonopin, which is an anti-anxiety medication. And then there was notation, notation from September 2017 indicating that her psychiatrist had begun tapering her from one of her antidepressant agents, which is called Celexa.
So as recent as September of 2017, there was a change in medication. Is that true?
Correct.
You also did conduct an interview with Morgan, you mentioned, in preparation of this report. Is that right?
That's right.
And that, again, was on October 26, 2017?
Correct.
Can you describe for the court some of the things that occurred during that interview?
Well, to summarize, most notably, Morgan had difficulty maintaining her emotional composure during that interview. As the interview progressed, she became overwhelmed, distraught even. Eventually, while discussing some of the issues related to her conditional release, she was crying so hard that she was having difficulty communicating. I gave her several minutes to try to regain her emotional composure. She eventually decided to terminate the interview because of the distress she was experiencing during those moments.
Well, what issues related to conditional release brought that upon Morgan?
At that point, we were discussing what her plans were if she were to be granted conditional release. In response to some of her ideas, I had pushed back mildly about the realistic nature and some of the challenges that she might face given her particular circumstances. In response to my mild pressure and pushing back, saying, you know, that some of these ideas may not work, she became overwhelmed. She was complaining that she didn't know how she wanted me to, or how I wanted her to answer, and became very tearful.
Well, do you recall what some of those ideas that you, I guess, challenged her on, saying they wouldn't work, were discussed?
I had asked her where she planned to live, should she be released, and as you can imagine, given her age, indicated a plan to return to the home with her mother and father. I asked her how she planned to spend her time. She indicated intent to basically spend the majority of time with her family and her cats. In response to questioning about what kind of services or what kind of supports she might need to ensure that things are going well for her in the community and that she remains psychiatrically stable, she denied belief that she would need any supports outside of her immediate family. Pushing back on that, saying that that wasn't realistic given what conditional release typically includes, became mildly defiant and irritable. Eventually, she had stated that she just wouldn't leave the home when I had confronted her with some of the potential challenges she might face given the high-profile nature of her charge and some of the negative stigma that might be attached once she returns to the community. And it was about this point where she became increasingly tearful, more difficult to engage in productive conversation. Around this time, I switched the conversation toward how she might know if she was struggling and needed more supports and more help around her. And she indicated a plan to rely upon her mother to notice if her mental health was decompensating, which is concerning given the history where she became quite mentally ill, was acutely symptomatic up to the index offense without people closest to her recognizing that her mental health was deteriorating.
Did you ever interview her mother, Angie Geyser?
I did during other parts of the evaluation process, so not for this particular evaluation, but in the past.
And they had no indication whatsoever that Morgan was as psychologically unstable as she was.
Right. It was an offense that took her family especially by surprise. It was completely out of character for her. And then the symptoms that were revealed following her arrest were quite striking and surprising.
When Morgan became overwhelmed and couldn't continue with your interview, was that how your interview ended with her?
It was.
Ultimately, Dr. Lundbohm, you offer the opinion to the court that Morgan should not be conditionally released. Is that right?
That's correct.
And I know there's a number of reasons or ways you arrive at that conclusion. If you could summarize those, please.
Briefly, to summarize, because it's a lot of information here, one of the things mostly driving my opinion is that when considering Morgan's risk for reoffense or violence or additional criminal acts, the evidence suggests that her mental health is of primary importance. She committed a near-lethal, very serious act of violence towards somebody that was closest to her, somebody who she considered to be her best friend, within that context of psychosis that was well hidden from people around her. Because of that, I'm very concerned that she's not symptom-free, that she continues to endorse not only psychotic symptomatology in terms of hearing voices, but also there's a layer of emotional dysregulation in terms of anxiety, depression. She admits to having quite a number of what she calls flashes of the offense that occurred and avoidance of dealing with any of it, trying hard to ignore that these events actually occurred, and they're disrupting her adaptive functioning, her day-to-day functioning.
Well, just as to that point, Doctor, I know you did specifically discuss that with her, and did she make any comments to you about feeling bad for the victim, Peyton, in this case, and kind of wishing they could just go back to being friends and that none of this had happened?
Yes, she has quite a bit of remorse related to this offense.
And what you've just described could be characterized certainly as some post-traumatic stress related to the offense itself. Is that true?
It appears to be on that spectrum, yes.
Okay. And I apologize, I interrupted you summarizing how you arrived at your conclusion. If you can continue that, please.
To briefly summarize, Morgan's an individual who requires additional intervention, additional therapy, as well as continued intervention in terms of working with a psychiatrist to find an effective medication regimen that manages her psychotic symptoms as well as her emotional symptoms, and also manages side effects that occur because of all of this. At this point, she continues to work with her psychiatrist to find an effective medication regimen, but it's a work in progress. They were continuing to make adjustments to the medication regimen up until the time that I was evaluating her for this particular evaluation, and all of the information through the records at Winnebago, as well as my own observations, suggests that she continues to experience quite significant symptoms that are not yet remediated.
When you met with her in late October of 2017, she had just recently been transferred to a different unit at Winnebago?
Yes, 3 days before our contact.
And do you believe that offered enough time to really evaluate how she would respond to that new unit?
No, she had actually just met with her treatment team for that unit on the morning of our contact. So they had very little knowledge of her on that unit other than the information that they had received through her chart. But in terms of personally knowing her, staff at that particular unit were unfamiliar with her. She had not yet had the opportunity to begin any form of treatment on that unit, including attending treatment mall groups at the treatment mall, as well as groups occurring on that particular unit. She was not familiar with the phase and level system attached to that particular unit in terms of what she would need to do to get more privileges, have more opportunity of freedom. She was just getting her feet underneath her when I saw her. excited to be there, excited to be moving on to the next phase of the treatment program, but relatively unaware of what that actually might include.
And was that important to your conclusion, the uncertainty as to how she would respond to this new unit?
Certainly the uncertainty of that, as well as throughout her entire stay at Winnebago, she had been on what's considered their most restrictive setting. And indeed, up until just a few months before our contact, had been on a one-to-one staff supervised condition where a staff member had to be within 2 arms lengths of her. So the supervision and support that she was receiving was quite significant. And so to suggest that she might be able to handle less severe or less significant monitoring is quite concerning, given that she was struggling to cope with the little bits of privilege and freedom that she was experiencing as she was going along.
And without knowing how she would respond to that, makes it very difficult to assess whether conditional release, which would include even much more freedom, would work or not. Is that fair?
Well, one of the things that I considered is, in looking back through her history, there seems to be a pattern where when she was discharged to less supportive and therapeutic and monitored settings like the detention center, there was a deterioration in her mental health such that she was then brought back to the Winnebago Mental Health Institute. And so it's concerning that previous efforts to put her into a different environment were unsuccessful because of Winnebago at this point seems to be beneficial to her.
Well, and when she went back to Secure at those times, she refused to take medications also. Isn't that true?
I don't recall. From the records, I recall that on one occasion she was not being treated, and because of that was not doing well. That prompted her return to Winnebago. I believe with this third admission, the records that I reviewed suggested that she was taking Abilify and potentially one other medication, and even with those medications had experienced decompensation within the detention center, prompting her third admission to Winnebago.
And it's after that third admission, she's been there ever since.
She's been there since, correct.
Doctor, do you have any rough estimate as to how many evaluations you've done related to suitability for conditional release?
I don't know the exact number.
Any rough estimate over your career?
Give or take 100.
Okay. And you're certainly aware of the statutory standard the court looks at in terms of whether or not someone poses a significant risk of bodily harm to themselves or others or significant property damage?
I do. Yes,
You're very familiar with that standard?
I am.
And in this case, what did you find regarding Morgan?
It's my opinion that release to a less restrictive environment at this point would constitute a substantial risk of bodily harm to herself, others, or to a property. Therefore, I'm not in support of her conditional release at this point.
And I would assume in the course of your career, the roughly 100 times you've done this, there's varying degrees of, well, have you found people that are suitable for conditional release?
Yes,
And there's varying degrees of how close or not close they may be based on your evaluations?
yes.
And in evaluating Morgan, is this to you a close call, or how would you characterize that?
In my view, and especially given the knowledge of her particular circumstances, all of the records, the observations that I made during the clinical interview, this was not a close call.
Not close in that you definitely believe conditional release is not appropriate.
Correct. At least at this point, correct.
I don't have any other questions, Judge.
All right, thank you. Attorney Cotton, cross-examination.
Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
I want to start by asking you about a comment you made a few minutes ago about Morgan's psychosis. You're aware of the history of the offense in this case, correct?
Yes,
and you know that it happened 2 weeks after Morgan had turned 12,
Yes.
right? And would you agree that 12 is a young age to be able to diagnose a condition like schizophrenia?
Yes, and as you might recall, back in the initial competency phase, when I did my evaluation, I was reluctant to put such a label on her.
And you've recognized that from the early stages, that it's difficult for somebody pre-adolescent or beginning the adolescent years to have that diagnosis.
Correct.
And that's because sometimes children and young individuals have fantasy thoughts that aren't a mental health issue, right?
That's correct.
Now, you had indicated that Ms. Geyser's psychosis, you used the phrase, was well hidden from those around her. And you would agree that there hadn't been, from your knowledge of the situation, there hadn't been lots of signs to her family members that Morgan had a severe mental illness.
Correct. If I could just explain, outward signs.
Right. There may have been internal things within Morgan that she was grasping with, right?
Right, and as I understand it, once searching through her bedroom, through journals, drawings, her computer, some of those outward signs became evident. They just were hidden in that they were not readily observable to those that were around her.
Right. So, and that's related to insight, isn't it? Would you agree that an insight refers to a person understanding their condition, right?
Right, an understanding of their own condition, correct.
Right, that they suffer from a disorder, and first they have to understand they suffer from a disorder, right?
Correct.
And what that means and how that affects them, right?
Correct.
And then the person also has to understand what they need to do to treat the disorder. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
What medications might be appropriate would be one way to treat a condition, right?
Correct.
So, and schizophrenia isn't some abstract condition that's newly developed. Would you agree with that?
Right.
Well documented for decades, people have known about schizophrenia, right?
Right.
So this isn't some novel mental health condition that isn't commonly seen, right?
Right.
And you would agree that most doctors, most psychiatrists and people in that field have experience treating that condition. Would that be a fair assumption?
I would be careful in saying most. I think that people who specialize in severe and persistent mental illness certainly have. There are clinicians that don't deal with mental health in that severity. So those persons would have less experience dealing with a schizophrenia spectrum disorder.
Okay, and schizophrenia spectrum disorders are treated with medication, right?
Yes, in conjunction with other therapeutic methods as well.
Right, the medication controls the symptom. Oh, my bad.
Yes, medications in conjunction with other therapeutic methods.
Right, the medication controls the hallucinations, the auditory and visual hallucinations, right?
That's the hope, yes.
And then the therapy addresses the coping aspect of things.
Correct.
And the educational dimension of teaching the person how they cope with the condition.
Correct. And the therapy can also help an individual with insight, learning to differentiate between the hallucinations, the delusions, the aspects that are not a part of reality in comparison to what actually is reality.
And psychiatry, or the practice of psychiatry, involves testing medications to see how an individual responds to them.
Sometimes, yes. If the medications are not effective right away, there is a process of trying different methods, trying different medications at different dosages, at different combinations to find the most effective combination that would help both alleviate the symptoms, whatever those symptoms are that the person's experiencing, in combination with managing any negative side effects that come of that, such as weight gain, tremors, other uncomfortable physical attributes that the medications cause.
So in many cases, it's trial and error.
It can be, yes.
And when it appears, when the doctors realize that one medication isn't effective, there's other medications that they might try, right?
Correct.
And that's sort of the history of what's happened during Morgan's placement at Winnebago. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Doctors have tried medications and they're trying to find the right combination.
Yes.
Your interview with Morgan was, in your report, you only did one report for the conditional release phase, correct?
Yes.
And that's your November 20th report, right?
Yes.
And when you identify a section called procedures, that relates to the things that you did and considered to reach your conclusions, right?
That's right.
And would you agree that the only person that you interviewed was Morgan herself?
For this particular
Yes.
evaluation, yes.
And that was the interview on October 26th.
Correct.
So about 3 months ago or so, about a little over 3 months ago, right?
Correct.
And you didn't do you haven't done a follow-up interview with Morgan by phone or in person, right?
No, I have not.
And you did review records at Winnebago. You reviewed Morgan's set of records, right?
I did.
But you didn't speak with her social worker, right?
I did not. I relied upon the documents generated by all of the individuals who have had contact with her throughout the stay of both this admission but also the previous admissions as well.
Okay. And so you didn't do a telephone conversation with Jessie Andrews, her social worker, who's been with her from early on, correct?
No, I just relied upon the records, the documents that Ms. Andrews created while doing therapy with Morgan.
Okay. And all the records, correct me if I'm wrong, but the records and materials you reviewed would have been up to October 26th of 2017, or did you review records after October 26th?
I cannot remember in this particular instance if there were some records that were submitted by fax after I saw her. Regardless, it would have been records up to around that time. Certainly not after I had submitted my report.
Okay. So the report is submitted November 21st. You agree with that?
I've got it dated November 20th, 2017.
Okay. So for sure, nothing reviewed after November 20th, right?
Correct.
Okay. And you would agree that Morgan has been at Winnebago now for about, since June of 2017. Is that, she's been there consistently since June of 2016, right?
2016, correct.
So about a year and a half or a little more than a year and a half, right?
Right.
Now, when you interviewed Morgan, she had been just transferred from Petersick Hall over to the Choices unit, right?
Yes.
And that's taking her from a medium security unit down to a minimum security unit.
Yes.
And that can be an overwhelming experience for a person.
It can be, and because of that, staff closely monitor individuals while that adjustment is happening. So there tends to be increased contacts, observations, note-taking within that time frame to ensure that a person is well supported during that transition.
Okay, so now we're about 3 months out from that transition now, right?
Yes.
And so would you agree that the 3-month history from her transition is important to know that information?
It could be, however, given these particular circumstances, given the totality of information that I have related to her functioning over the last several years, information through that 3-month period would not necessarily change the opinions and conclusions that I'm offering here.
And that's not what I'm asking.
Okay.
I'm not asking you to change your conclusion right now,
Okay.
okay? All I'm asking is, would you agree that that's important information to examine?
I guess for what purpose would be my response. So
Well,
for the
I wanna-
purposes of
I
my
wanna-
evaluation encompassed all the information up until that point. So for the next evaluation, it certainly could be and would be reviewed. However, given my opinions offered back in November, I used all the information that was available at that time.
Right, so I'm going to just ask the same question again. Would you agree or disagree that her progress now over the last 3 months at a minimum security unit is important information to consider when reaching a conclusion?
Certainly could be.
Okay. And you don't have any independent knowledge today whether you've reviewed anything past, the only thing you can say is that perhaps you reviewed materials up to November 20th, right?
Correct. That's exactly what I did.
And I had asked you before whether it can be overwhelming for a person to move to a minimum security unit, and you agreed it can be, right?
Absolutely.
And that's why staff members will pay close attention to a person during that time.
Right.
Now, you talked about Morgan's history sometimes where she had decompensated, let's say, when moved to a less restrictive environment or a less restrictive setting, did you say?
What I had said in my report is therapeutic and supported environment.
Okay. So what you were talking about is the times that Morgan has been transferred from a therapeutic environment back to the jail, right?
Correct.
Those are the only two places she's been.
Right.
So there's a history of her deteriorating when she goes to jail, right?
Right.
Okay. And that would be expected with a person who has schizophrenia. They would be more, they ought to be in either a therapeutic environment. They ought to be in a therapeutic environment. Would you agree?
I think it's beneficial to be in a therapeutic environment. I don't know that I would say it's expected for an individual to necessarily experience decompensation. What we would hope is that a person is well managed in terms of their medications and has effective coping strategies that they would be able to independently handle any kind of stressor thrown at them in the community or also being transferred to the detention center or jail. But you would hope that an individual has that psychiatric stability to warrant the change in the environment.
Do you know whether they offered Morgan medication in the jail?
I can just go by what the records say, and it appears that she was taking, I believe it was Abilify and another medication prior to coming to the Winnebago Mental Health Institute on this third admission, which started in June 2016.
You agree that when you reviewed the records in this case, the records showed that Morgan remained compliant with taking her psychotropic medication?
Yes, she has always been compliant with her medications.
And would you agree that there's no history of her acting aggressively towards her others or towards herself during her admission?
During her admission, correct.
Or during her stay in the jail?
As far as I know, correct.
And there isn't any evidence, would you agree that there isn't any evidence of a psychiatric decline now that her environment has been changed to the Winnebago Hospital?
I don't know that I would agree with that. What the information suggests is that, especially during her co-defendant's trial, she was experiencing significant stress. And as part of that, the records show that she was displaying and complaining of acute anxiety, acute depressive symptoms. As she did during the interview with me, she had reported post-traumatic stress syndrome spectrum issues related to flashbacks, wanting to avoid anything that reminded her or triggered her of these memories of the actual offense. And so the information reviewed suggests that actually she did experience deterioration in that part. There's also indication to suggest that she was experiencing times that she appeared preoccupied by internal stimuli. And then also, as I had indicated, she had reported to me that she was experiencing still this voice of Maggie.
You would agree that in your report you indicate that Morgan has demonstrated increased psychiatric stability across the course of her current hospitalization?
Absolutely. When in comparison to my first contact with Morgan back in 2014 to where she is at now, it's undeniable that she's experienced gains through her use of psychotropic medications and gains through her treatment that she's experienced and taken part of at Winnebago. That being said, she still has a ways to go. She's still an individual who requires intervention.
Right. And you're aware there's a Chapter 51 that's in place against her, right?
I am. I believe the records had mentioned that there was potential that the commitment end date was coming up. As to whether or not that had been renewed, I don't know anything about that.
And you're familiar with that process and how that can be renewed every year, right?
Excuse me. Yes.
Okay. And you're aware that it has actually been renewed repeatedly in Morgan's case, right?
Yes.
And you're aware that as part of a Chapter 51 process, people can be given medication orders, right?
Right.
Where they're forced to take medication.
Right.
And nobody's ever had to force Morgan to take medication.
Right. As indicated, she's always been compliant with taking medications.
Now, during Morgan's time at Peter Sick Hall, she participated in individual therapy 1 to 2 times per week, you noted?
Yes.
And attended therapeutic groups, you noted?
Right.
And this is a unit for adult offenders, right?
Correct.
So Morgan's not with other individuals her age.
Correct.
she hasn't been with individuals her age during the entirety of her placement. Are you aware of that?
With exception of when going back to the detention center and there are other youths. But correct, it's Winnebago, the units that she's been on, it's adult-oriented in part because of her legal status.
Now, you you indicate in your report that Morgan has insight into her illness. Do you still agree with that?
Yes,
Do you agree that she understands what her symptoms are and can verbalize them?
she can do it to some extent. Where her insight appears to be lacking is in terms of when having conversation with her about how would you know if you're deteriorating and what would you do. This is where, as I previously had testified to, she had put a lot of the onus of making that determination to persons outside of her, so specifically her mother, saying that her mother would be able to identify that and would take appropriate action.
Do you have a lot of experience working with 15-year-olds who are have schizophrenia?
I do a number of evaluations related to juveniles. I don't provide treatment to juveniles.
How many evaluations of a 15-year-old girl with schizophrenia would you say you've done?
I couldn't begin to estimate. I don't know.
Are you able to estimate it as the state had asked before about your total number?
I don't think I could in this instance.
Do you think it's more than 10?
I don't know. I've evaluated a number of youths over since I have been at the Mendota Mental Health Institute in 2008, some being females, some having schizophrenia or psychotic spectrum disorders. I don't know how many that might be.
Would you agree that Morgan can name the medications that she takes?
Yes,
And she's aware that she takes those medications in conjunction with schizophrenia and major depressive disorder?
yes,
And Morgan has expressed a desire to remain medication compliant, has she not?
she said that she does not like the medications and wishes she doesn't have to take them. However, she does recognize that the medications are important for her to continue to take, especially because she doesn't want to experience deterioration in her mental health.
Right, and she's told you she wants to continue taking the medication.
Right.
Because she doesn't want to go psychotic, as she put it to you, right?
Right.
Okay. Now, the goal here, would you agree that the goal in general is for Morgan to become symptom-free? That's the long-term goal.
Ideally, yes.
And that can take time because psychiatrists have to try different medications on a person, right?
Correct. It's different for every individual.
And Morgan has been symptom-free now. Well, you indicated she told you she had heard a voice or voices a couple weeks before you met with her, right?
Right. In addition to both by way of my observations, self-report, and the medical records indicating a number of other symptoms that she was experiencing outside of those immediate positive psychotic spectrum symptoms.
You said it was a few weeks before your contact. That was what you had said?
The voice of Maggie? Yes.
Yeah. And are you aware that her treatment professionals, her social workers, indicate that the last time she heard voices was August? Are you aware of that?
No.
Now, since Morgan had been transferred to Choices about 3 days before you viewed her, she hadn't earned privileges or had additional liberties yet. Isn't that correct?
Right. She was so new to the institution or to that particular unit that she hadn't had the opportunity. As mentioned, she had just met with her treatment team in the hours right before my contact with her.
Have you had a chance to review any of the other doctors' reports that have been done for conditional release, or have you not had access to that?
I have not.
Okay, so you're not aware of any other doctors' findings in this case?
Right.
Do you believe that it's important for Morgan, given her age, to have contact with other adolescents? Is that important for her development?
I do believe that that would be developmentally appropriate, and that's a challenge that Winnebago is going to face likely if she is not conditionally released, to provide developmental and age-appropriate treatment and opportunities for her in conjunction with the psychiatric treatment, the therapeutic groups.
Now, is there an adolescent residential treatment facility that's available for girls in the state of Wisconsin?
I don't know.
you're aware that such a facility doesn't exist within Winnebago, which is one of the problems they have, right?
I'm aware that Winnebago has a unit for civilly committed youths that includes females, but that Morgan's legal status prevents her from being on that unit.
Oh, and Morgan can't be in that group because this is a criminal case and she's under a different type of commitment.
Right, her legal
Okay.
status prevents that transfer.
You're referring to the Chapter 51 process if there was no criminal case, right?
Correct.
Do you believe that Morgan, are you familiar with any residential treatment facilities that might exist for Morgan?
I don't know offhand.
Did you look into any before you prepared your report?
I did not for this purpose, no.
Did you look into any treatment foster homes that might be viable alternatives for her?
I did not know because it is my opinion that the placement that's most appropriate for her at this point is Winnebago.
And where would Morgan go next after Winnebago?
Well, it's my understanding that if she were to be granted conditional release, the Department of Human Services has 60 days to develop a plan that would include discussion of what would be appropriate for her placement next, whether that's her return to her family home, whether that is a placement in what we would say a step-down facility, like some kind of community-based group home, residential treatment center. But that is a determination that her conditional release treatment team and the Department of Human Services and Winnebago staff would work together during that 60 days to determine.
And do you think it would be beneficial for Morgan to have a mentor upon her discharge to help with her development of skills?
Eventually, yes. I think that would be important.
Do you think that it's important to have as an aspect of Morgan's treatment stress reduction and mindfulness training?
Absolutely.
And do you believe that when Morgan is ultimately released that she should have individual psychotherapy sessions?
Absolutely. And actually, I would stress that that would be a method that is very important for her because throughout her stay at Winnebago, she has had access to and has participated in individual psychotherapy, and she has identified that as being the most helpful aspect of treatment to date.
As opposed to being in groups with mentally ill adults, right?
Right.
Can be uncomfortable, among other things, for a 14 or 15-year-old to be with mentally ill adults.
It certainly can be. However, I don't know that that explains the totality of why she prefers individual treatment versus some of the group treatments.
Now, your conclusions start on page 10 of your report. Is that fair to say?
If I could just peek. That's correct.
I don't think it's really necessary to have it on the screen, but Rob can bring it up if he wants. So in your findings, you have your report in front of you, correct?
Right.
So in your findings, you had talked about the fact that Morgan is showing increased psychiatric stability over the entire course of time that she's been at Winnebago. We've already established that, right?
Right.
And you've said that there's, in your opinion, there's room for continued improvement, correct?
Right.
At least as of when you saw her, you were convinced of that, right?
Right.
Now, you indicate in the last sentence of your first point that Morgan continues to work closely with her treating psychiatrist in an effort to find an effective medication regimen that balances symptom management and negative side effects. Is that one of your findings?
Yes.
So that's what you're saying is that it's important for her to continue working with the doctors, right?
Right, and she's done a good job doing that throughout the course of her stay. She's been very vocal and willing to comply with any recommendations that her psychiatrist has made, has had a collaborative relationship with that person.
And so that first paragraph relates to your concern over the symptomology, her continued experiencing psychotic symptoms, right?
Right.
And then in your second paragraph, or your second finding, is really sort of the same thing, right? Because the second finding, you're talking about your concern that she still has psychotic experiences, right?
Right, and what I did essentially is to break it down into kind of these two groups of symptoms. So you have these outward psychotic spectrum symptoms, which would include the voice of Maggie, but also you have this additional these additional types of symptoms that appeared to be interfering with her adaptive functioning at that point, which included the subjective distress, the depression, the anxiety, the flashbacks, the sleeplessness, the avoiding being alone because of having all of this tumult happen at any point that she was not being distracted by outward stimuli.
It would be concerning to you if Morgan weren't showing remorse, right?
Yes.
That would be a problematic sign, right?
Right.
And when people, and you've talked about her remorse, but that's in part what's probably contributing to the depression. Is that a fair assumption?
Absolutely.
The recollection of events and appreciating what she did.
Absolutely.
And that causes that and legal proceedings certainly can cause anxiety in a 15-year-old, right?
Absolutely.
Things like depression and anxiety, those conditions in and of themselves don't require institutional placement.
Not necessarily, although in extreme circumstances it can, including if a person's experiencing depressive symptoms that are so severe that they're suicidal or engaging in self-injurious behaviors. That would be an individual who requires institutional care. That is not
Okay.
Morgan to
Right.
specify.
Okay. So her depression and anxiety doesn't require hospitalization in this case, right?
I don't know that I could tease it out like that. I think that's too simplistic because what we have is a human being and the entire package is what you see. All of these symptoms are her. These are all symptoms that are working together to, at the time of my evaluation, was significantly impairing her ability to even get through the interview with me, was impacting her ability to get through day to day at the institution without tearfulness, without crying, without having these moments where other people were noticing something's wrong.
Do you think it would have been a better idea to interview Morgan maybe a few weeks after you had interviewed her so that she could have had time to adjust to her new unit?
It certainly could have. However, my opinion isn't based on just that single interview. My opinion is based upon the totality of all the information that I reviewed, which included information prior to her current Winnebago stay, but also months' worth of documents related to her institutional adjustment, her symptoms, her changes to her medication regimen, her participation in groups and therapy and education. So it's too simplistic to break it down into, my opinion is based just on that interview. It's not. It's based on all of that information combined.
You indicated in your third point that Morgan is not yet done processing painful memories and emotions from the offense, right?
Right.
Really that dimension of things is going to be a lifetime process, wouldn't you agree?
Likely, yes.
Okay, so it's not something that we can necessarily just address through a medication. That's more of a therapeutic approach, right?
What I would think is that it would be a combination of both a medication approach and participation in different kinds of therapies, different modalities of therapies to be able to address the severity of the symptoms that she's currently experiencing related to that. And ideally, as she continues to progress through those kinds of treatments, the intrusive nature of that will impact her less, such that she would be able to get through an interview related to conditional release.
You're not aware of whether she was able to get through the other interviews with the other people that saw her, are you?
I don't know.
Okay. Now, in terms of Morgan's, you testified before about you pressing Morgan on part of the release plan aspect of things, right?
Right.
So she's 15 years old, right?
Right.
And presumably, if she leaves Winnebago, will either live in either at home or some other environment, right?
Right.
And Morgan understands the idea that she could live with her parents, right? She knows her parents and has a relationship with them. Do you agree with that?
Right.
And you haven't talked to her mom, but you're aware that her mom has been involved in every aspect of this treatment process.
Yes, her family is very supportive.
And heavily involved.
Yes.
And you would agree that, well, I want to understand what you meant by pressing Morgan. So were you describing to her the fact that people in Waukesha might recognize her? Is that something you were discussing with her?
That was part of it. When I'm saying pressing, it's not enough for an individual in these kinds of evaluations to say, I don't know, and want to move on to the next question. That's not a sufficient answer in my perspective. So to ask questions of, well, what kind of stressors might you face? I don't know. Well, can you think of anything? It's not enough to just leave it there. So when I say press, I'm not bullying in any way. I'm just asking following up questions and challenging questions that she might not have thought about, including there likely is going to be stigma related to her because this has been a very high profile case featured in the media, and she might face backlash to that, and that's a realistic thing that she needs to think about prior to being released.
And that backlash could be more severe in a community like Waukesha, where the case would have more publicity, right?
It's hard to know.
Did you talk to her about that, about where physically she would go upon her release, or did you not get to that point?
She had expressed belief that her parents had been thinking about moving to a different community to try to get away from, in part, the stigma of this particular offense, but also knowing that the victim lived in the community still, to provide some separation.
And that, depending on the type of community they move to and its proximity to Waukesha, that could impact the level of attention she might have, right?
It certainly could.
Thank you. Those are all the questions I have.
All right, thank you. Any redirect?
Doctor, would there be a certain length of time for which you would like to see Morgan on a stable medication regimen before you would consider conditional release?
I don't know that I can put it into those specific terms of there's an X finite amount of time that we would need to have her be symptom-free, because it's individualized. Every person does respond differently to medications. What I would want to have her do is to display psychiatric stability for a prolonged period of time, in absence of hearing voices, if possible, in absence of crying spells, being able to confront some of these issues related to her offense, instead of having flashbacks and doing avoidance. I would want her to be able to do some of these things prior to being conditional release, while also displaying the ability to maintain the psychiatric and behavioral stability in decreasing amount of staff supervision and support. And as indicated, she's had very close supervision up until this point, and it's unknown how she might respond should she be released into the community, especially given that in the past, when moved to less supportive environments, it's not gone well.
Would the time that's gone by, say in November, December, and January, in your opinion, be enough to show prolonged stability?
No.
If Morgan had indicated to staff or employees at Winnebago that she was symptom-free since August, that would not be consistent with what she told you, is that right?
Right. And it wouldn't be consistent with my observations.
How was that?
That she was actively experiencing symptoms during the moments, not psychosis, not hearing voices, but she was actively experiencing distress. She was unable to effectively pool her psychological resources to get through our interview. That was very atypical in doing a conditional release evaluation. Then, in addition, all of the records suggest that she had been experiencing increased depression and increased anxiety around the time frame of this. So it's not enough just to look at those psychotic spectrum symptoms. That's just part of her whole entire clinical presentation. So at the point that I was meeting with her, she was not symptom-free.
Thank you. I don't have anything further, Judge.
All right, thank you. Any further cross?
No, we need a few minutes for our next witness, Your Honor.
All right, so then, is Dr. Lundbohm under a subpoena?
She is. She may be excused by the state.
All right, any objections?
No, just Judge, I had talked to the state about not having a sequestration order in this case because it could be valuable for witnesses to hear the opinions of others, so she's welcome to remain if she'd like.
All right, very good, but otherwise you're released. Thank you for being here. And then you wish to take a
10
few minutes
if we could?
recess?
Yeah.
We'll take about 5 or 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
I note that I did receive Joseph Lautner's letter. That did come through the system, and I had an opportunity to read it during the break. The procedure is as I expected, but as what we're doing is states presenting any witnesses they have, then the defense will present witnesses they have, and then I'll hear arguments. Is that the process? From the
Yes.
state and from the defense?
Right.
All right, very good. Now we're seeing we'll hear a witness at this time who's appearing by video. True?
True.
So who is being called?
This is Dr. Kenneth Robbins, Your Honor.
Okay, Dr. Robbins, I can see you. Can you see me?
I can, Judge.
And I can hear you as well, so that's good, and you can obviously hear me.
I can.
So where are you located?
I am in Vallejo, California. I'm at a hospital.
All right, but you're there as a treating physician, or as a treating
Correct.
psychiatrist, true?
Correct.
All right. I'm going to ask you to stand and raise your right hand. That's fine. You can stand normally, and I see your hands up. My clerk's going to swear you in.
Do you swear
Okay.
to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
Then thank you. You may be seated. And I'm going to ask you to state your full name and spell your last name.
Kenneth Robbins, Robbins.
Thank you. Now, as part of this is a video conference to present the testimony. It's an appropriate way to present a witness that's unavailable. The part of the system that we're using, it's a new system. So this is the first time it's been used certainly in Waukesha County. So be aware if we have any quirks in how it's presented, we'll pause and take care of those. With that, I'm prepared to begin. So Dr. Robbins knows in order to have a more clear picture of you, I'm going to turn and look the way I'm looking. I can see you better looking this way than I can if I look to my right. So with that, then Attorney Kugler.
Yes, good morning, Dr. Robbins.
Good morning.
We're here on the Morgan Geyser case. I'd like the court to hear a little bit, though, about your training and experience as a physician and your background. Could you take us briefly through that?
Sure. I went to medical school at the University of Michigan, did a residency in internal medicine, and then a residency in psychiatry, and am board certified in both. I've been a clinical professor of psychiatry at the University of Wisconsin for many years, going on 35. I have had a number of different positions over the years, including teaching at the University of Wisconsin, medical director at the Mendota Mental Health Institute, medical director for Rock County. I've been teaching psychiatry in the law and have had a private forensic practice for many years. And I currently also work as Chief Clinical Officer for Adventist Health on the West Coast.
And is that a full-time position on the West Coast?
It is not a full-time position, no.
Okay, and that's where you are today, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, and so is that about 1 week a month you are working in California and then 3 weeks a month in Wisconsin? Is that how I understand it?
That's exactly right.
Now, you know Morgan Geyser, correct?
I do.
And you have experience with her, and I want to talk a little bit about that experience with her. When did you first come in contact with Morgan Geyser, and can you take the court through your background with her?
Sure. I interviewed her initially on, I'm reading from my report that I assume the judge has a copy that's dated September 17th of this 2017.
Yes, we all
I
have that.
initially, I'm sorry?
Yes, we have that report. Thank you.
Okay, good. So the first time I interviewed Morgan was on June 10th of 2014 at the Washington County Detention Facility. I interviewed her a second time, December 4th of 2014 at the Winnebago Mental Health Institute. A third time on June 6th of 2015 at the Washington County Juvenile Detention Facility. And then most recently on August 28th of 2017.
And that was that at Winnebago Mental Institute?
Correct. The most recent one was at the Winnebago Mental Health Institute.
Okay. So how, when you first met Morgan and interviewed her on June of 2014, what was the purpose of that?
So the first time was, I think, related to whether Morgan was competent to stand trial.
So it was a competency evaluation.
Correct.
And what were your findings at that time?
I did not believe she was competent to stand trial at that time.
Did eventually Morgan's competency get restored?
Correct.
Were you involved in that treatment?
I was involved in that evaluation, yes.
But not the treatment to restore her competency, correct?
No, that took place at the Winnebago Mental Health Institute.
All right. Now, when you first met Morgan in June of 14, how did you find her at that time?
Morgan was quite psychotic at that time. Morgan believed, for example, that Slender Man was real. She believed a number of fictional characters were real, including characters involved in Harry Potter books. She believed that she had special powers that would allow her to transport her mind to wherever she wanted it to be, so she didn't have strong feelings about whether she ended up in an institute or in a jail. She felt like wherever she went, she would be fine. And Morgan was very frightened about what Slender Man might do to her family if she were to somehow betray Slender Man in her mind.
Now, let's talk about how, well, first of all, the reason you most recently saw Morgan was to furnish the court an opinion on her suitability for conditional release. Is that right? Or discharge?
Yeah, I guess I'm not exactly sure, since she hasn't been found, since she hadn't yet been found not guilty by reason of insanity. I guess the question was, what is the most appropriate placement for Morgan at this time?
Yes, you're right. But it's similar to the kind of evaluation you do for a conditional discharge, true?
Yes.
Okay. Now, fast forward from 2014 through to 2017, how did you find her more than 3 years later?
A dramatically different person. Morgan had become insightful and aware of what she had done, was extremely remorseful and guilt-ridden. She had been sufficiently depressed as she realized what had taken place, that she had actually been started on antidepressants at the Winnebago Mental Health Institute because they were concerned about her. She was very clear that the treatment she had gotten with the medications was critical for her. She did not want to stop the medications. She felt like she was now thinking more clearly, and the thought of committing some other act as a result of her psychosis was clearly very frightening to her. A fairly remarkable insight for somebody of her age.
What do you credit that transformation? What do you credit to it?
Well, I think Morgan's a bright child, and the treatment has been very effective.
When you interviewed her, did you do any testing of her?
No formal testing. That's usually something psychologists rather than psychiatrists might do.
And that's right, you're a psychiatrist, which is a medical doctor, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, how did you find her placement, her current placement at Winnebago Mental Health Institute? Do you find that to be a good placement for her?
No, I mean, it's a safe placement and she's gotten appropriate treatment, but no, I think in terms of her growth as a person, her continuing treatment, I don't think it's an appropriate placement.
Do you know whether she's around other adolescents at Winnebago?
So that's really the core of my concern about the current placement. She's on an adult unit. She is by far the youngest person on the unit. She doesn't have any peers. Whatever schooling she gets has to be done individually, and there's really no ability for her to socialize with peers.
Why is that important?
Well, it's a critical part of growth for any person during their adolescence, to learn how to interact with peers, to get a sense of who they are and how they get along with peers, but particularly somebody with the kind of illness that Morgan has. Interpersonal interaction with peers is a really critical part of her development and of her capacity to do well despite her illness.
Have you run in your many years of practice in this area, have you run into cases such as Morgan's where a person has been hospitalized for so long before sentencing?
No, this is unique.
How is Morgan doing, from your knowledge, with compliance with medications?
So from my knowledge, which includes keeping in touch with Winnebago staff, including this week, Morgan has been very compliant. Just as she told me, she recognizes the importance of the medication, and there have been no concerns or issues with regard to her compliance.
So you followed this case since June of 14, including as recently as this week?
Well, including talking to Winnebago staff this week, that's correct.
Okay. And can you tell us which staff people you might have spoken to this week to get updates?
Well, they asked me not to specifically say their name.
All right.
If you don't mind, I'd rather protect them.
Okay, that's fine. So if Morgan, is there anything in your opinion as a psychiatrist who knows Morgan's case as well as you do, is there anything to be gained by keeping Morgan continued placement at Winnebago?
Well, so Winnebago's done an excellent job of providing treatment for Morgan's psychotic illness, and they have kept her safe and the public safe for an extended period of time. But she has reached a point, in my view now, where her psychotic disorder is very well treated and her own personality has reemerged, and she is an empathic, kind, compassionate, bright young woman who is very remorseful about what's taken place, and I don't believe there is anything that she would gain by remaining on an adult unit at Winnebago at this time.
Are there any, well, you said one thing that Morgan really needs is to be near other adolescents. That's important for her development, right?
Correct.
And that won't happen at Winnebago, is that true?
That's true.
And are there, is one of the goals in treating somebody, an adolescent with a severe mental illness, is to help them become a productive citizen?
Exactly.
And does that, as good as they've done at Winnebago, are they equipped or geared to work on those issues?
Well, Morgan's reached a point where they don't have the ability to provide her a standard schooling experience, a peer group to learn how to interact with. And so there's some very basic and very important parts of adolescence that she is missing out on by remaining at Winnebago.
Why are these important parts of adolescence?
Well, in part because that's really what adolescence is learning how to be an adult, learning who one is, learning how to be part of interpersonal interactions with peers, how to learn how to adjust your behavior. And then schooling is obviously a really critical part of being an adolescent and preparing for some kind of adult life and adult career. And when one has schizophrenia, this kind of socialization is particularly important. Schizophrenia really has three components. There are the positive symptoms like hallucinations and delusions, and certainly Morgan has experienced those symptoms, but there are also cognitive symptoms, and there are what are called negative symptoms, which are things like apathy and a decrease in energy and a decrease in motivation. And to avoid those, the best thing we know about are to improve interpersonal interactions and give someone a meaningful existence.
Okay, so socializing is an important part of that to prevent negative symptoms. Is that what I understand?
Exactly. It's an important part of the treatment of schizophrenia.
Okay. What about this cognitive area that you're talking about? Can you explain that a little bit?
So we know that over time there are changes in the way the brain develops related to schizophrenia. This is a physiologic, biological illness, and we believe that the deficits that one can get with schizophrenia can be minimized with education and socialization.
And the education that Morgan's getting at Winnebago, do I understand, is a couple hours a week, just somebody comes in and works one-on-one with her, is that right?
So I don't know exactly how many hours, but I know it's limited and it's just one-on-one, that's correct.
Well, Morgan is with she's with women right now at Winnebago, isn't that true? They're
Adult women, that's right.
But they're adult
Yes.
women, right?
That's correct.
Am I understanding that an adolescent wouldn't mature the way she should if she is exposed only to adult women?
Well, certainly one doesn't develop a peer group. It's a very different kind of relationship with adults than it is with your peers.
Now, she's on 2 antipsychotic medications, is that right?
That's correct.
Oh, and what are those?
Abilify or aripiprazole and haloperidol or Haldol.
And as far as your knowledge, how her compliance has been great with taking her medications, is that true?
Yes.
And she's presently taking those in an oral form. In other words, she takes them by her mouth, is that right?
Correct.
Are there other forms of those medications that are more long-lasting, or more long-acting, I guess would be a better word?
There are, particularly if one has any concerns about compliance, there are long-acting injections available both for haloperidol and aripiprazole.
Okay, so if somebody was concerned about Morgan's compliance, which we have no evidence that she doesn't comply, but if the court or somebody was concerned about that, we could be looking at doing the injectable forms, right?
That certainly ensures compliance, and the injections for haloperidol are given approximately every 2 weeks, for aripiprazole approximately every 4 weeks.
Okay. Now, is Morgan also on antidepressant?
She is.
Do you have an opinion as to why she started taking an antidepressant? What happened?
So what the clinical notes I have the clinical notes from Winnebago, and from what the clinical notes suggest is that Morgan, as her psychosis dissipated, she became much more self-aware, much more insightful, about what had happened, what she had done, and she became overwhelmed with guilt, remorse, and sadness.
Is there anything wrong with her having become insightful and depressed, filled with guilt? Are these things abnormal or normal or something in between?
I think for somebody who is compassionate, somebody who has empathy, it's what we would anticipate. I guess I would say it's normal.
So when you see her now with this insight into what happened before, how does that compare or contrast with how she was when you first met her, Doctor?
Oh, it's a dramatic turnaround. When I first met Morgan, she had a pretty hard shell. She did not appear to have any clear empathy for the young woman who was victimized in this matter. She, I think, felt like she had done what she had to do to protect her family, and that it was unfortunate there was a victim, but she didn't appear to have a great deal of empathy for the victim herself. And she had very little insight about what had led to her behavior, and that all has really transformed.
And it's important for somebody with a mental illness to have insight, isn't it?
Well, it's important for compliance. I mean, it's, it has, as in Morgan's case, it has its good news and bad news. It has, made her very depressed and sort of overwhelmed with what she did. But of course, in the end, I think it will be important, and I think in the end it's helpful to her, but she just has to learn to understand her illness, which is what she's working on, and accept that it was the illness that led to this behavior. And I think for her, it has motivated her to be compliant with the treatment.
Was Morgan, did she cooperate with you during your most recent evaluation with her? Was she
Yes.
willing? Did she sit through it willingly?
Yes.
Okay, did she ever ask to terminate the interview or in some way become non-compliant with?
Understands the benefits of taking medications, correct?
Correct.
And has also indicated to you that she, based on that understanding and based on what she did in the past, that she would never think of stopping to take her medication. That's basically what she said, correct?
Correct.
It's also probably fair to say, though, that you've interviewed a number of people over the years that have said something similar to that when they were trying to get released to the public or get the equivalent of conditional release. Conditional discharge, I should say, that then later when they got out in the community, stopped taking those medications, correct?
Correct.
Now, one of the things I wanted to ask you, you indicated in your report that the last change to her antipsychotic medication was May 24th of 17. And
Correct.
We have had some indication that some of her other medications were changed, that in June they added Topamax to her medication regimen, and July increased the dosage of it, and then in September started tapering down her dosage of Celexa. Are you basically saying there's no significance to her treatment of those medications because they're not antipsychotics?
Well, I don't think they have any bearing on her dangerousness. Those are really medications that were to help manage the mood difficulty she was having as she became insightful.
So she was depressed, is basically what we're saying.
Fair, that's right. She was depressed.
And isn't it true that, at least on some occasions, depressed people do commit serious crimes that involve bodily injury or even death to themselves or others?
Well, certainly severe depression is associated with suicide risk. That's correct. But I think what we're talking about here is Morgan's primarily her danger to others, although fortunately for this, she never became suicidal.
I know one of the things we talked about is her lack of socialization in her current placement. Now, when you interviewed her in September, that was before her current placement at the facility, correct?
Correct. She's been moved since I saw her.
And in spite of that, in her new placement, you're saying she still doesn't get any socialization with peers, and by peers, we're talking about other individuals, at least close to her age, correct?
She is still on an adult forensic unit.
And are you aware that she is at least getting some level of socialization by communicating with individuals through her computer?
I am. I think that's fairly minimal, but yes, I think I am aware of that.
Now, I know you weren't present, and by present I mean like you are now, when Dr. Lundbohm testified before you. She talked about interviewing Morgan October 26th of 2017, and Morgan saying at that time that within the last few weeks she'd actually had her audio hallucinations that she was talking to Maggie. Were you familiar with that?
So Maggie is a long-standing hallucination that Morgan has experienced. She's had that since she was a little girl. When I met with her, and what the clinical staff at Winnebago have told me, is that since before I saw her, Maggie has been gone. There was a little bit of Maggie still there when I spoke with her, but this was almost a crutch. It was almost hard to tell if this was a real hallucination. She can't remember ever being without Maggie, although in my most recent conversations with Winnebago staff, they tell me that even Maggie now is gone, that there are no remaining psychotic symptoms.
All right, and I just
So
want
I
to...
did talk in my report about there being minimal psychotic symptoms, and that's what I was referring to. There was still some question of whether Maggie was there, but that the Winnebago staff have assured me that that is no longer the case.
So I just want to, I'm pretty confident I know what you just said, but I'm just going to verify it for my own knowledge. You're saying that when you spoke to her in September, there was still some indication that she might be communicating with Maggie, and that since that time, you've spoken to staff at Winnebago, and they've indicated to you that that's no longer an issue. Is that a fair way of putting it?
It is.
And I guess one final thing. I know you've talked about your belief that interaction with peers and socialization are important for her treatment going forward, correct?
Yes.
But you've also acknowledged that, at least in terms of the statute that we're dealing with, that's not an issue that the statute refers to. The statute simply refers to that risk of harm to themselves or others or serious property damage, correct?
Correct.
No further questions.
Further direct.
Yes, Doctor, you understand that if, at the point that Morgan would be placed outside of Winnebago, she would be monitored for probably decades by the Department of Health Services, right?
Correct.
And so if there would be some sort of deterioration, wouldn't it be their job, along with others, to replace Morgan in a more restrictive setting if it was necessary?
So their job will be to monitor her compliance and her symptoms and her acceptance of whatever other treatment they deem to be appropriate, and if for whatever reason she's not cooperating or the symptoms return, it would be their responsibility to make sure she was in a safe place.
And with that, with the knowledge that she's going to be monitored for a very long period of time, doesn't that lessen any kind of risk in Morgan's case?
I think it does dramatically, although again, what I'm recommending at this time is not for Morgan to return home yet, but for her to be in a secure facility where she would get psychiatric treatment and continue to be monitored as she just starts to transition, but most important, to have some kind of education and peer interactions.
Right, to be placed in a place where she can be with other adolescents.
Exactly.
With this treatment that you've outlined. Okay. Yes, thank you, Doctor. That's all for me.
Any further cross-examination?
Nothing further.
All right, thank you. Doctor, I do have one question. This is Judge Bourne. I'm looking at your report from September 17, 1917. On page 5 in your conclusions, section 3, the last sentence says, quote, her most recent significant medication change was less than 4 months ago, so at this time, it's my recommendation that she remain hospitalized for further treatment, end quote. Now, when I read that in light of your testimony today, I conclude that your recommendation is that she stay at Mendota in an inpatient setting, although you found that if an appropriate alternative setting was located by Mendota, you'd recommend that she be placed there. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, Winnebago, but yes, exactly. I think you are reading that right. My change really has to do with the fact that she's an adolescent, that she's done extremely well, and that I am not recommending what would normally be a conditional release. I'm not recommending that she return home. I'm recommending that she stay in a secure facility, but one that is more amenable to treatment of adolescents.
All right, thank you. Any further questions for Dr. Robbins based upon what I asked and his answer?
No, Your Honor.
Anything from the state?
No, sir.
Well, Dr. Robbins, thank you for appearing today by video. I appreciated your courtesy in that regard. We'll then disconnect the video connection. Have a good day.
Thank you,
Thank you
Doctor.
for allowing me to participate.
With that, then, further witnesses.
Yes, we'd call Jessica Andrews. I think she's here.
Ma'am, stay standing. Raise your right hand.
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
Then be seated. Pull up to the microphone. It's the bar with the red light. And state your full name and spell your last name.
Jessica Andrews. Andrews spelled A-N-D-R-E-W-S.
You're soft-spoken.
I'm sorry. Jessica Andrews. A-N-D-R-E-W-S.
Very good. That's better. Thank you. All right. Mr. Cotton.
Good morning, Miss Andrews. How are you?
Good morning. Good. Thank you.
Before we begin today, I just want to establish what your role is. Where do you currently work?
I'm currently employed at Winnebago Mental Health Institute.
What is your job there?
My current job is I'm the Director of Forensic Services.
Okay, and you know Morgan Geyser, correct?
Correct.
And you understand that you've been called as a witness today to speak about her privileged medical information,
Correct.
which would otherwise not be disclosed publicly.
Correct.
Is there anything that you need to ask Morgan before we begin this process to proceed, or no?
I would ask Morgan's consent for me to disclose privileged information that has been shared during individual psychotherapy sessions if asked on the stand.
Okay, Ms. Geyser, are you okay with that?
Yeah.
Judge, the record.
Yes, sir.
And you understand you could say no.
Yes, sir.
And when you say yes, that means that Ms. Andrews will respond to questions and make disclosures of things you've said in a private setting. Understand that? Is that okay?
Yes, sir.
All right. Do you need any more time to talk to Attorney Cotton?
No, sir.
All right. Thank you. Well, I'll take the consent, and I'm satisfied that she's consulted with her attorney and that based upon my knowledge of the case and the longstanding representation by Attorney Cotton, that her consent is a knowing voluntary consent. You may proceed.
So you are the Director of Forensic Services?
Yes.
Does that mean you run Winnebago, or what does that mean?
I oversee the programming in two of the patient buildings on the facility, some of which are, two of the buildings would be Peterson Hall and Gordon Hall, and both of those buildings have forensic unit and civil units within them.
Okay, are those the medium security units?
Peterson Hall is the medium security unit. Gordon Hall is a minimum security unit.
Okay, we heard earlier, you've been here this morning listening to the testimony, have you not?
Yes.
So Gordon would be the same as Choices, basically.
Choices is a unit located within Gordon Hall, yes.
Okay. So are you currently are you a therapist by training?
I am. My background is that I am a licensed clinical social worker, and I was first employed at Winnebago Mental Health Institute as a clinical social worker in 2004. Since that time, essentially, I have been working there as a clinical social worker. In August of 2017, I received a job change where I became the Director of Forensic Services.
A promotion.
Correct.
So you have a master's degree.
I do.
From where?
UW-Madison in social work.
Okay, and then you became an LCSW.
Then I became an LCSW.
And you worked as an LCSW for 13 years until your promotion.
Correct.
You're still licensed that way, though, right?
Yes.
As an LCSW, were you given the opportunity to work with Morgan ever?
Yes.
When did that happen?
When Morgan was first admitted to Winnebago Mental Health Institute for competency restoration in August of 2014. Oh, I'm sorry. Sure. When she was first admitted at Winnebago Mental Health Institute in August of 2014, I was assigned as her social worker, and I provided her with competency education as well as individual psychotherapy.
So on the competency side of things, you helped Morgan get to a point where she could process what was going on.
Yes.
And then on the individual psychotherapy side, you were providing what type of services?
We were working towards understanding her illness, working towards accepting her illness, symptom management, a variety of things in the context of individual therapy.
Okay. Did you, so have you worked continuously with Morgan for 3 years, or was there any interruption in that?
The interruptions in my work with Morgan would be when she was discharged back to the juvenile detention center.
Okay.
However, during each of her admissions to Winnebago Mental Health Institute, I was assigned as her social worker and individual therapist.
Okay. And then we've heard some testimony today about Morgan having been currently placed there since June of 2016. You've been her therapist since that time straight?
Yes.
And even once you became Director of Forensic Services, did you continue with Morgan?
I have continued with her, providing her individual psychotherapy. I am not her assigned social worker any longer.
Okay, but I'm assuming because you have a relationship with her, you've remained involved?
Yes.
How is your relationship with Morgan?
I would say we do have a strong therapeutic alliance.
A therapeutical alliance, did you say?
Yes, a therapeutic alliance, a strong therapeutic relationship.
Do you feel that Morgan trusts you?
I believe so.
Does she disclose things to you?
Yes.
Now, you've seen Morgan at her worst and at her best. Would you agree with that?
Within the context of her hospitalizations, yes.
Okay, you've seen her when she's been untreated,
Correct.
going back to 2014.
Yes.
And you've heard the two doctors testify today, haven't you?
Yes.
There's been discussion of Morgan improving substantially over the course of her time at Winnebago. Would you characterize it that way?
I would.
How would you describe her her improvement? Well, let me take a step back. Until recently, Morgan was in the Peter Sick unit, right?
Yes.
In Peter Sick is a medium security adult unit.
Yes, it is.
Is it a highly secured environment?
It's our most secure environment in our hospital.
How did Morgan do? Has Morgan done over the year or so that she was there?
She has consistently adhered to all of the unit and hospital rules. She has remained medication compliant. She has remained active in her treatment. There have been no major behavioral problems, no acts or threats of aggression towards others.
What about towards herself? Has she attempted suicide?
No.
Or been a risk of danger to herself that you've seen?
She has not.
Okay. And she's been the victim of some things from other people, hasn't she?
Yes.
Some aggression by other mentally ill adults?
She has.
And how has she processed those situations?
It was, I would say, rather traumatic for her. There was an incident where another patient physically aggressed towards her. It appeared to be rather unexpected. She met with me. We discussed it at length. She did very appropriate. She was very open in processing her feelings about that. She did relay in sessions following that occurrence that it helped her come to terms with possibly how the victim of her crime may have felt when she was hurt.
So she was able to take her experience of being physically victimized and relate it to her being the perpetrator of something.
Yes.
Do you consider that was that a mature way of responding to that?
I consider that a mature way of responding to that, yes.
Do you think of Morgan, does Morgan appear to be a mature 15-year-old?
She does.
Okay. During her time at Peter's Sick, when you've worked with her, has she ever been forced to take medication?
No.
Is that something that can happen to people who are there?
If there is an order to medicate, that is something that potentially could happen.
Now, at the beginning of her medication process, Morgan had not been medicated before, right?
Correct.
And she didn't know what that would be like to take medication. Would you agree with that?
I would agree.
And when you discussed that with Morgan, how did she respond when you told her that she would begin this process?
Initially, she really verbalized that she didn't feel she needed medications. She did not want to take medications, but that should that be ordered or be an expectation of her treatment, she would be compliant with it. Okay.
And did that prove to be the case then?
It did.
And do we know for sure that she takes her medication, or is this something she could be hiding?
Our procedures with administering medications is that they're administered by our nursing staff. And when Morgan or any other patient approaches the cart, they're handed the medication by staff, and they are to take the medication right at the cart, and there's 2 staff observing.
Okay. Why was Morgan kept in Peter's Sick Hall for such a long period of time? Why didn't you transition her down before recently?
That was a result of her legal status. She was placed at our hospital under a Chapter 51 commitment order with this pending criminal case, which would essentially be as though it's a legal detainer, essentially. So as a result of that, and because she was charged in adult court for a felony, she needed to be placed on our medium secure unit.
Which is that what her needs required, or is that just the protocol at the facility?
That's the protocol based on her legal status.
So she's been at Peter's Sick Hall. She was at Peter's Sick Hall longer than therapeutically she would need. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. Had it not been for that exact legal status, she would have transferred to a minimum security unit sooner than what she did.
But if Morgan were showing concerning features, you wouldn't have just transitioned her to minimum, right?
That's correct.
Okay. You mentioned Chapter 51. I want to just talk about that for a minute. Have you worked with Ms. Geyser's Chapter 51 providers?
I have.
And to this day, are they still involved in her life?
They are, because she is still under the Chapter 51 commitment.
Are you, if we were able to take away the criminal case, and this were just a Chapter 51 placement, would it be recommended for Morgan to transition out of Winnebago at this point?
Yes.
But because it's a criminal case, then it has to be a different procedure.
Correct.
And you're waiting on the judge to make those determinations?
Yes.
Okay. Now, Morgan was taken from, or moved to minimum security. I'd like to know a little bit about how she's done since she moved over there. You heard Dr. Lundbohm's testimony?
Yes.
Is it true that Dr. Lundbohm visited Morgan 3 days after her transfer?
To my recollection, I believe that's accurate.
Was that a difficult time for Morgan when she had been transferred?
Morgan, at that time, was very relieved that she was able to be transferred to a minimum security unit. She had spent a great deal of time in our medium security, and the move to a minimum secure unit allowed her the ability to be able to have some more freedoms, such as more increased access to our courtyard, other things, the use of an iPod, those kinds of things, so she could listen to music. So there were some more freedoms that she really embraced.
The state talked about a computer. Is she using a computer?
She does not have access, any internet access. No.
Okay. You heard the questions about her chatting with people online?
Then that's not accurate. She
It's
is
not happening.
absolutely not. We don't allow that for anyone.
Okay. She doesn't have instant messenger where she's chatting with people?
No, she uses a telephone
Okay. Or writes letters?
or writes letters.
Old school. So, Ms. Geyser, going back to what you were saying before, over at the minimum security unit, she has more privileges.
Yes.
And was there an adjustment period for Morgan to get accustomed to the new facility?
Somewhat, because there is for most people. It certainly is, there's a different milieu and adjusting to having access to different things, as well as a different peer group and a new treatment team. In my opinion, I do not feel that that was a difficult adjustment for Morgan to make.
Okay, she's made it pretty well.
Yes.
Were you present for the Dr. Lundbohm interview?
No, I was not.
Did you speak with Morgan immediately after that interview?
I cannot recall exactly. I believe I spoke with Morgan shortly after the interview. I do not know if it was the same day.
Okay, there was some talk, you heard the talk about Morgan having, being very emotional during that interview?
Yes.
And crying and not being able to handle it all?
Correct.
Is that something that you recall taking place at Winnebago and that you worked with Morgan on?
Yes.
What happened?
Morgan has at times had difficulty discussing, the day of the crime, the events surrounding that. So she has become tearful at times. She does address that in sessions. I feel she uses those therapy sessions very appropriately to process those types of feelings.
And does she process those feelings more effectively when she's in a therapeutic environment with people she trusts?
Yes.
Okay. Have you had trouble recently with Morgan being able to discuss the circumstances of the offense?
I would ask you to define trouble. She presents in session as very open and willing to talk. Very seldom do I ever feel like, or I need to have to ask her questions to get information from her. She's very open in sessions. When there's something troubling her, she discusses it.
Okay.
So when she does discuss the events of that day, yes, it's very upsetting to her, but she processes it openly in session.
And as a mental health professional, is that to be expected that somebody would have trouble processing something like stabbing their friend?
Absolutely.
Okay. And coming to grips with the fact that it was mental illness that caused the crime?
Yes.
Or caused the behavior?
Yes.
Now, when Morgan's been in the minimum security unit, has she continued to take medication or did she become resistant?
She's continued to be 100% compliant with her medications.
Dr. Lundbohm had talked about about there being a history of decompensation when Morgan has moved to other environments. Did you notice decompensation here?
What I've noticed, although I never worked with Morgan and I was not involved with her during the time she was placed at the juvenile detention center, but assessing her immediately upon return to the hospital from those placements, I would say it did appear that her mental health did decompensate somewhat in the environment of the juvenile detention center.
Okay. So focusing on the medium security to the minimum security, has there been a deterioration there?
No.
Has there been an improvement, or how would you characterize her transition?
Again, she has transitioned very well to that living environment. She does not present any longer with symptoms of psychosis. She does present with some depression, and she does experience what she describes as flashes, which I would attribute to symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder. I do not believe that's in relation to a change in a medium to a minimum secure unit. I believe it's a growth of insight on her part, that she has a better and a deeper understanding of what had happened and what this means for not only her life, but the lives of the others that have been affected.
Was it difficult for Morgan when she learned that Anissa Wire was going to be brought over to the Winnebago Mental Health Facility?
Yes, it was.
Why was that difficult for Morgan?
Morgan expressed to me in session that she felt upset about that outcome because she felt that the co-defendant was taking advantage of Morgan's mental illness.
Okay, from what she had heard, she felt like her genuine mental illness had been taken advantage of?
Yes.
And did you work with Morgan on how to process that?
Yes, and we continue to do so.
And will the facility keep the co-defendant separate from Morgan?
I cannot comment on the co-defendant.
Okay. So Morgan was expressed that concern about Anissa. That's what you feel comfortable saying?
Yes.
Now, did Morgan make any comments about Anissa having the ability to stop the offense, or did she not talk about that?
Morgan has shared that periodically in therapy sessions, having the belief that Anissa was the one person who could have stopped this from occurring.
And didn't?
And didn't, in Morgan's words, yes.
Now, when Morgan was, during the time that she's been in the minimum security unit, you said Morgan has no psychotic symptoms.
Correct. She does not present with psychotic symptoms at this time.
So is that just based on self-report, or are there other things you look to?
Self-report and observation, not only by myself, but other staff involved in her care.
So is everybody at the facility a trained professional?
Within the capacity of what they're working, yes.
Okay. Well, when you say observation, is that are we talking janitors, or are we talking mental health professionals?
We are talking mental health professionals. So on her treatment team, she has a psychiatrist, therapeutic services staff, which are occupational therapy, recreational therapy, occupational therapist assistants, registered nurses who have mental health training, and then also our psychiatric care technicians who work on the units right with the patients as well. So
Okay.
Observations between all of them.
Over the course of now 90 days or more than 90 days?
I would estimate, yes.
For the placement in the minimum,
Yes.
right? And going back before her placement to minimum, well, let me just ask it more specifically. Can you pinpoint when the psychotic symptoms were effectively eliminated from the hospital's perspective?
I would estimate it was August or September of 2017 when the psychotic symptoms were gone.
Does that correspond with a medication adjustment, or what does that correspond with?
Well, while I cannot comment specifically on her medications, because that's out of my scope of practice, I would say with medication adjustments that occurred last late winter, early spring, that really began to alleviate a lot of the hallucinations and other psychotic symptoms that she was experiencing.
Okay. And is it fair to say that mental health professionals don't just rely on a person's self-report, they also look at how the person is functioning and acting in deciding whether they're responding to things?
Yes.
You might be asking somebody a question and they might be looking up at the distance and it appears that they're seeing something, right?
Correct.
Or they wheel their head around and it appears they're hearing something, right?
Yes.
So when you say that Morgan has no psychotic symptoms, you're referring to the constellation of observations by all the professionals as well as Morgan's reporting with you.
Yes.
Has Morgan been honest in general with her reporting on her mental health symptoms?
I believe her to be consistently honest with her reports.
Do you find her to be a deceptive young girl?
No.
When you say you find her to be honest with her self-reports, does she come to you when she's struggling with things historically?
Yes, she does. She will seek me out. She will ask for increased sessions. She will ask staff to relay a message to me so that I can see her and help her.
And does Morgan have connections to family members, or have they abandoned her?
She has a strong connection to her family.
Okay. Do they visit her and interact with her?
Very frequently.
Is it important or unimportant for family to be involved in a 15-year-old's mental health treatment?
It's very important for any family member to be involved in any loved one's mental health treatment, especially in the case of somebody who's so young. She's 15. Yes.
Does this family, from what you've seen, let's talk about her mother. Have you had contact with her mother?
Yes.
Does Morgan's mother appear to be actively concerned about her daughter's well-being?
Yes.
Does she strike you in your interactions as a mother who is hyper attentive to her daughter's condition?
I don't know if I would quantify it as hyper attentive. I believe she's appropriately attentive.
Okay. And does she strike you as a mother who tries to minimize this whole process and in any way?
No,
Does her mother appear to be somebody who's resistant to the idea of medication?
no,
Does she appear supportive?
yes.
And I ask that because I want to know whether this is a situation where professionals are working with Morgan, clearly making progress with Morgan. And then are there setbacks when Morgan goes and interacts with her family? Do they appear to be counteracting your approach?
No.
How often does she get visits?
I'm going to estimate 2 to 3 times a week.
And those are a combination of supervised and unsupervised, or are they all on, how are those?
They're supervised in a more of a large group setting, so they come during our regular visiting hours in that building. So there are staff present in a large room where a variety of patients are visiting with their families.
Who's the youngest is Morgan the youngest person at your facility?
Morgan is the youngest person on her living unit.
In the minimum security area?
Yes.
And was she the youngest person at the medium security, Peter Sakal?
Yes.
And she's with women right now, right?
The unit she's on now is a co-ed unit. So the unit has men and women.
Okay, but the living arrangements are women with women, right?
In the hallway that they are in, there are her room. She does not have male roommates, but there are men who reside in the same hallway. They share a day room. They do not share restrooms.
Okay, and are all the people in this unit people who share her legal status?
Yes.
People who have been found not guilty because of their mental illness?
Correct.
And people who are awaiting disposition?
Some of them are, so they are people who have been allowed the opportunity to be on our minimum security unit. So they are provided the treatment to work towards a conditional release.
Okay.
Some of them may have petitioned and maybe their conditional releases are pending.
Got it. So if judge were to order some additional period of time for Morgan to remain committed, she would remain in that unit that she's in?
Yes.
And can she earn privileges in that unit?
She would be able to, yes.
Privileges where she'd be able to be released into the community?
Eventually, yes.
Like going to Walmart and things like that?
That is a privilege that the patients on that unit can earn.
Okay. It's based on it's based on behavior, I'm assuming.
It's based on behavior. It's based on engagement in treatment. It's based on medication compliance, sometimes length of time. They do need to establish a great deal of trust, and all of those are always staff supervised. There would never be a patient in the community without staff.
Okay, Morgan has developed trust with you, for example, right?
Yes.
But she's got a new team now, right?
Yes.
So that team has to develop the trust with her?
Yes.
Is Morgan, you talked about engagement and treatment. Is Morgan engaged?
She is.
There was some discussion about individual psychotherapy. Is that something she prefers over groups, or?
It seems to be. What I would point out is due to the length of time that Morgan has been hospitalized, she has been through a number of our groups, oftentimes more than once. So when she was in Peter Sakal, she ran through our cycle of groups several times. She has offered the opportunity for some new groups while she's in Gordon Hall. However, she honestly has done a lot of learning and a lot of excellent group participation.
Okay, so it's covering a lot of the same stuff?
A lot of them are.
What? And it's with adults though, right?
It's with adults.
Okay. Educationally, is Morgan she doesn't go out to school, right?
Correct.
So some educator comes into the environment and teaches her for a couple hours a day?
Yes. One of our adult educational teachers does come see her individually, and that's for 3.5 hours a week she receives that.
So a normal 15-year-old, an average 15-year-old who wasn't in the facility would be going to school 8 hours a day or so, right?
Correct.
Morgan doesn't get that.
Correct.
She gets about a half hour per day if you average it out over a week, right?
Yes.
Now, and do you agree with the characterization of her as being somewhat bright?
Yes.
Okay, so and education would be important for her. Does she seem to excel in it?
Yes.
Have you witnessed any Is Morgan, after her transition, did she become more violent or more dangerous since her transition?
No.
Do you see Morgan as a dangerous person to others or herself at this state?
No.
If the judge were to order her released to the community, is that something that you would support, having worked with her?
I would believe that Morgan no longer requires an inpatient hospitalization at the current level of intensity she's receiving it. I do not view her at this time to be a danger to herself or others or property.
So you think the needs that she has don't correspond with the intense services of Winnebago?
Not in such a secure environment, and I do need to say I have not completed an assessment of risk for future dangerousness or in any other setting outside of Winnebago Mental Health Institute.
That's something you could do?
That's something that possibly could be completed. In the case where somebody is committed under an NGI and petitioning for a conditional release, the independent evaluators would really be the ones to assess that rather than the facility.
And would those evaluators speak with you as Morgan's treating professional to get your input on things?
Some of the evaluators do.
Okay. Based on your clinical experiences with Morgan and your personal interactions, you haven't seen any evidence of her being a risk to the public at this stage?
No.
Provided she's taking her medication?
Correct.
And you haven't noticed problems with that during her stay at Winnebago?
Not whatsoever.
Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ma'am, and this may have been my misunderstanding of Dr. Lundbohm's reports, but she talks about Morgan having contact on a daily basis with a youth who presently resides in Texas, and I guess I assumed that meant a computer based on something else, but how is she having that contact?
Through telephone and letter writing is how she communicates with those outside of the hospital.
So she has no access to a computer?
She does not have any internet access.